Welcome to Quilters Rule the World. I am Teri Lucas, one of many hosts of this delightful show. This week, we intended to bring you a fuller conversation on Tracy and I when we talked about grief. Life happens sometimes, and the conversation is getting pushed a little bit further out. Tracy's at Quilt Market. One of our other quilters, Debbie, is on vacation with her family, and our recording schedule kind of got moved around. So, Lori, Michelle, and I have what turned out to be a two-part conversation on batting. No, not that kind of batting. I don't, I don't know that any of us are really sporty people anymore. We're going to talk about batting. And it turns out that Michelle is a delightful, curious question asker. So she's going to actually end up asking a whole lot of questions. So please enjoy part one of a two-part conversation on batting practice. Welcome to the Quilters Ruled the World. I am Teri Lucas, and with me tonight I have
Lori Baker.
Michelle Friedman.
Woohoo! Our crew is slightly lighter tonight than normal, and we're going to have a beautiful discussion about a very hot topic. Debbie is off with doing some family things, and Tracy is getting ready to go to Quilt Market. Now, before we dive into our topic tonight, are either of you missing market like I am this year?
Yeah, missing market.
Absolutely.
Hashtag missing market.
It's it's a lot of fun, but it's also an opportunity to be inspired. You see so much stuff, new things to try, new ideas for quilts. Oh my goodness. Miss it a lot.
Well, and then there's the people.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a big part of it.
But if you two aren't there, then I'm not going.
I feel better now.
Good.
I feel better now. Yeah, this is the first time in maybe the second time, but the first time in years that I have not gone, and it's tugging at my heart in a big way. Tracy's going to be there. This will be the first year I haven't seen Bob, and oddly enough, we live in the same state, but like not seeing Bob, like who's going to run, their fingers up his hair? I mean,
Is that a thing you do?
No, is that a thing? No, I don't know if I want to know.
I've never actually done it.
Oh,
Uh,
good.
there have been a couple of other Gen Q people, like when we were with Gen Q that actually did that. Um, so Michelle, I see you have some delightful earrings tonight. Can you tell us?
Do you like my earrings?
I
Aren't they
do.
lovely? I don't have a tiara, so I needed to accessorize.
Hmm.
Yeah, so this is a thing I'm starting. If you need to wear your ribbons for entering shows and or anything, I mean maybe you get ribbons from other things, but yeah. So yeah, this is my decoration, and we'll see how long it lasts in my ears because it's not very comfortable.
Well, if you decide that you're going to take your ribbons off, we'll take the tiaras off.
Okay.
To be in solidarity with you.
Right.
I had these are from our Oregon State Fair, and that was in August, and I hadn't been able to pick up my quilts. I had a friend pick them up, and I finally went and got my quilts on Sunday, so a couple days ago, and I got to see my ribbons. It was very exciting. So yeah, there you go.
Yay!
I'm you know how some of us just aren't good at like taking compliments or like being proud of our achievements. I'm just taking this moment to be like, I got some ribbons and it's exciting. Yeah.
Well, I'm first of all, I know we're going to go slightly off topic here. I know how hard it is to enter a quilt show. It feels very and we will address this in another episode, friends. It feels very vulnerable in so many
Yes,
ways, right? Because we're not just we're not just showing people what we've done. They also, not for nothing, we're quilters. We see all the flaws. We see all those places. And for some people, it is just, it, it it's very hard to not say something.
Well, and I'm going to say this, if anyone is cultural curious, and I know we'll have this topic, in depth later, the state fair is such a great way to be patriotic, but also get feedback. And that for me is what encouraged me to enter quilts again in the state fair, because it's judged by certified judges. So you get fantastic feedback, and you get to hang your quilts with like other people from the state. So it's something I really enjoy doing. And I don't know if this is in every state, but you get comment cards. So anyone can leave you a comment, and getting that envelope back with people just saying, I love your quilt, or that was creative to, add embroidery. I never would have thought about that. It's just really cool. So it's, you know, you might, you might be confident and like enter and win festival in like one swell foop, but if you're not quite there yet, state fairs, I highly recommend it.
I I agree. Anywhere that you can get good feedback is a good thing. So, Lori, do you have any thoughts on this?
well, just the funny thing about the little community thing that I used to enter my things in, and the judge didn't like that I didn't hand stitch on the binding. And one time I was the only entry and I got second place.
Wait, you didn't like that you did hand stitch or that you did not do hand
That I
stitch?
did not. I machine stitch my binding,
Yeah,
have for years.
that is a criteria though that I've noticed as well. I'd be really curious to learn more about the quilt judging process. Maybe that's something we can
Yeah.
invite a judge on one day or ask some
Oh,
questions.
we may have accidentally done that, but that'll be a topic for another
Hey.
conversation. Well, accidentally on purpose. Anyway, so um we have a little bit of uh a very I don't want to say it's a hot topic, but it can be a bit of a hot topic.
Have a soft topic.
Yes.
Well, or I was thinking hot as in generating heat.
Mhm.
Oh, yes.
Mhm.
Yes. So who has thoughts on batting? Michelle, you get to go first tonight.
Those little animals that hang upside down in the trees outside, bats.
Bats.
Ah!
Or not like batting like baseball season, go Dodgers. That kind of batting. Okay.
Michelle,
Why?
the Dodgers.
Don't judge.
Okay.
Don't judge.
I'm not judging. I'm
Okay, wait.
I'm a diehard Yankees fan living in the middle of Central Texas.
I love the Yankees. That's not even like an issue. Like Yankees are the best, but go Dodgers. That's all I'm going to say. Basically the same team at one time in history. So batting, I just was working with my long arm quilter
Yes.
the past week, and she asked me a question that I responded to quite viscerally. She said, "Would you like me to use poly batting?" And I said, "No!" And it like echoed through the building in this like resounding, like, no, 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 no. So you can imagine this. And then I said, well, okay. And she did. And I love it so, so, so much. So this was this epiphany I had this week about poly batting because one, I wanted to be able to see the quilting really well. And two, just promised me that it's going to be the softest, most cuddly quilt I've ever had. And she was not wrong. This is the first time I've ever used poly batting.
Uh,
Purpose.
what I have thoughts clearly, but what was your first impression about when she asked you this? Like, what was it that like your immediate no, like I felt that deeply, like in my toes felt that deeply. But what did you think? What were you thinking that the batting would be?
So I had a bunch of thoughts all at once. I thought, what's going to happen to my quilt when I wash it?
Okay.
It's and I don't understand why she would ask me this question. Because I always use the cotton batting that she has. And then it was more like, why is she asking me this question? Wait, what don't I know? What's happening? And then I,
Mm.
kind of had more of a curiosity than the, instant of adversity where I was just like, No." And she's really an incredible partner and, was thinking ahead because she knew I needed to photograph this quilt. And
Okay.
she was just like, why don't you try it? I think it's gonna look really beautiful in the photographs. And I'm like, okay, but like, what about like using it and washing it? And she's like, I think you're really gonna like it. And I said, let's do it.
Okay. Did she tell you what brand of batting so you could look it up?
Probably. It was a bit of a whirlwind. It was like, can you fit me in between all the other quilts you're doing for market? Because pretty please. And yeah, and she did. Lori, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, my fault.
Maybe a little bit. No, it was my fault because I don't know how to say no. I'm like, sure, I can do that. And then,
Um, I I think I think it is a good risk always to work. Well, I think it is a good risk generally to work with your if your long arm quilter is making or your quilter is making a suggestion to hear them out because you may be completely delighted by what you get back. Do you know if it was an 80/20 or is it just 100% polyester?
oh, it's 100%. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, well, I'll circle back to you guys. We can put that in the episode
Well,
notes because
we'll put that in the show notes. Lori, what do you use for batting?
I use warm and natural. And here's my reason. I love when I wash the quilts that the cotton batting shrinks a little bit. And it just gives the quilt a vintage look. I like that.
Hmm.
So I use warm and natural a lot. I quilt for my sister,
Hmm.
and she prefers polycotton.
Okay.
I do notice when I do her quilts that my quilting shows up more.
Great.
And if I were quilting something where I really wanted my quilting to show, I'd probably use 2 layers of batting.
Oh, tell me
Would
more
you
about that.
would you use 2 layers of warm and natural, or would you choose a secondary fiber?
I'd use a secondary fiber and I'd use wool.
Okay. Michelle, in answer to your question, there are a lot of award-winning quilters who will use a cotton that is a low loft cotton for the back of the quilt, and then either wool or silk or a poly blend for the top so that the stitching really shows. So you get the structure of the cotton, so it really helps the quilt hang square. And then you have uh the stitch the stitches sink in a little bit more into the other fibers, like even silk. Um, and what that does is it shows off your stitching more. So you get that beautiful, um, and it adds a little weight to the quilt. So if you're hanging it somewhere, it's gonna just hang beautifully.
I have a question about that actually,
Sure.
but I don't want to interrupt your thought.
Go ahead.
Well, also, I just texted my long arm quilter. Her name's Neela, and she said she used Quilter's Dream 100% poly.
Okay.
So there you go. This is not a paid sponsorship. Um, but
No, we did ask the question though, so
so I was at a quilt show about a month ago, and I had two large quilts in the show, and they were hanging from sleeves, and I noticed that the bottoms of the quilts were drapey. And my sister actually was the one that pointed out, she's like, oh, it's too bad that, there wasn't something to weigh down the bottom of the quilt. And the two quilts that were in the show, I make quilts to use, so they will go on a bed eventually. And I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought like in advance about them hanging a certain way in a show. And until that moment, and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't even know what I would do. Like, would I like sew in a chain on the bottom, or, like things I know about like making clothes, you sometimes do that in, tailored jackets. But
Mhm.
what do you do for that if you're making a larger quilt for competition for a show?
um block it.
But they were square. It's just that I think that, well, maybe not. Let's talk about that. What does that mean? How do we
Okay.
do it? What are all the
So
things?
so your sides can all be the same size and the quilt can still be out of square, meaning that there can be stretch in one direction or another, kind of along the diagonal, right? And so not only are you measuring your center points vertically and horizontally, but you're also measuring corner to corner.
I have never done that one time ever in my entire life. Oh my
Well, and
God.
that's where you find out if a quilt isn't square, right? You agree, Lori?
Yes, yes.
And
And I'm like Michelle in that I make my quilts for beds. And if it's not quite square, it's not quite square.
No, and this is so I would say this, if know your audience, right?
Yes,
This is something that I tell my beginner quilters all the time. Know your audience. Right
yeah,
now, like your audience is for the most part, your audience is people, right? It is people who are going to use and love these quilts. But if you're making a quilt for show, you do want to go through that. You may need to go through that process of squaring up a quilt. And
yeah,
and part of that has to do with um depending on what you've got, like whatever your setup is, you're going to either T-pin it to the floor, you're going to T-pin it to your bait to your design wall, you're going to do whatever, but you're going to use like a level or a T-square or something else. I've seen a lot of quilters lately going into the the home department type stores, and getting laser levels to make sure that their lines are straight. And you're like there are other visual cues that you're going to use, like your seam allowances, and making sure that those are lined up, like they're spaced where they're supposed to be so that you can do that. And then the quilt gets spritzed, and in that state, not to the point where it's soaking wet, but it's got to be damp enough to either go all the way through, or you will have spritzed the back first. You spritz the front, and then different quilters do it different ways. Some just wait, and then some have fans blow over them so that the quilts aren't damp for too long a period of time.
Who do we know that makes the straightest quilts?
Um, Gosh, that is a really good question. I saw one quilt last year at the OSQE show in Dallas, and for the life of me, I cannot remember her name. Um, but there, oh, I want to say Sally Collins. But there, Susan Cleveland makes really straight quilts.
Yes,
Her piecing is off the hook. And I I would presume that she goes through, depending on the quilt, any of the best, Sherry Reynolds, who was Best in Show winner, Janet Stone, who, oh my goodness, like she's just out of this world, but her quilts are always square. I'd also say Scott Merkin and a few others.
We'll make sure to write all those names down and put links if there's links to put
Yeah.
in episode notes, because I definitely now have a list that I want to go learn more of quilters I want to learn more about.
I like from time and like Carol Breyer Fallard, she's got to square her quilt. I mean, for the amount of machine quilting that she does, I'm sure, and she's got all this curved piecing in there, so she's gonna want to make sure her quilts are square. Like, so we have like a whole generation of people who square up their quilts. But
So
but again, it's knowing your audience. So if your audience is the person that you're sleeping with, the kid down the street, um, those are not quilts that you square up, unless they're horribly out of square. Um, but if you're doing show quilts, yes, you want to know, you definitely want to do that.
and then the batting, so I want to just kind of ask you a question, because before you were talking about putting the cotton on the back and then the more lofty fiber over that.
Mhm.
Um, and we're squaring up our quilt before we're quilting it. No, after.
Yes, you are. I mean, you go through that, you want to make sure that when you send your quilt, like for you, you send your quilt off to a long armor. So you want to make sure like it is square when it walks out the door.
Yeah, you don't want to be the person at the long arm conference that everyone's snickering about.
True.
Because that happens, right?
Yeah, yes, and sometimes very publicly.
I'm teasing. My long arm quilter has made me a better quilter. I really believe that, just because she'll share with me things like pressing and things that have helped me. Just like my quilting friends are gonna make my quilts more square by having this conversation. But so you square it up, and then of course, when you are quilting, that's gonna take a different life. The quilt takes on a different personality because you're adding stitching to it. Do you
Hmm.
then square it up again before you trim it, or it's already square, or what do you do?
If it's a competition quilt, well, okay, so I approach things from a slightly different point of view, but I still have I'm not necessarily entering pieced quilts for judging. I'm entering whole cloth quilts for judging. I
Yep.
still need to make sure that those are square. So like my diagonals have to be correct. My horizontal and verticals need to match. Um, and and so yeah, it goes through a squaring up process, which is also why I don't make wildly big quilts, right? Because it's much easier to handle, like a 40 by 40 and squaring that up or squaring it down to like 39 or something along that line so that everything's straight across, and my binding is on there correctly. And so, but when you're working with a pieced quilt, you have different opportunities to make sure that after the quilt has been quilted, that your lines are still straight, right? Because it's the quilter isn't doing this on like they will have done everything that they could to make sure that everything is laying flat, knowing that you're entering this into a competition. They will do their best to make sure it's laying flat. But then that one extra step of you going through the process and going kind of almost block by block, row by row, making sure using your rulers to make sure that everything is still in square gives you the opportunity to present your best face, your best quilt to the judges.
So, um, you mentioned when you were talking about layering quilts about some different fibers. You mentioned wool batting and silk batting.
Mhm.
What are your experiences with those, both Lori and Teri?
Lori, do you want to start? Or would you rather I start?
I actually, I can't even think. I've done one with silk.
Okay.
Um, I've never done any with wool. And the silk one was tiny.
Okay.
Um, and it gave it some real pretty loft.
Did you layer it with cotton or was it just the silk?
As I recall, I did have cotton. Yeah, it would have been cotton for the first layer.
Neat.
And yeah, it pretty, pretty, pretty.
Right? Do you have a picture of that? Probably not.
Probably not.
Um, so when I first started quilting to kind of brings I was a warm and natural fan, but I was also a hand quilter, and I found that the I used warm and natural as a hand quilter, which I don't regret, but it was very tough on my wrists because I have a naturally tiny stitch, and one of the things that I kept running into, and I actually wanted to ask you about this, so think about this, Lori. How do you deal, like I had a hard time dealing with needle deflection when it came, because Warm and Natural has other stuff, unless they've started really carding, they have like bits of twigs and leaves and things still in there. So I found it hard to deal with. And then when I moved to machine quilting, I found it hard to deal with as well. Because there'd be just slight needle deflection and it would look like my stitch was off, but my stitch was fine. It was what I was hitting. Um,
What's, can you define needle deflection for those of us
so
that haven't hand quilted?
when when you're hand quilting, you can actually feel it hitting and moving off to one side or the other, depending on the how it's hitting whatever it is it's hitting. Or you just can't go through that spot. So, so you have to either back out a little bit or figure out how to go around it in some way to avoid it when you're hand quilting. When you're machine quilting, when the needle goes down and it hits one of those bits, it'll kind of go off to the side just slightly, and it'll look like most people call this tension. It'll look like something's just off with a stitch, like you wobbled a little bit while you're stitching.
Okay.
Um, it was when I started going to quilt shows that I started seeing that there were other battings on the market that were available to us. And one of the things that I went to immediately because I loved the feel of it were the low loft cottons. And there are a number of companies out there that I have tried that I love their low loft cotton. It's just thin enough and it shows the stitching well. The stitching sits a little bit more prominent, like on the surface rather than kind of sinking in. And I kind of like that look. Um, it was probably when um I really started competing, like seriously competing, and I haven't done this in a while, that I started using 2 layers of batting. The understanding the differences in how things feel, I started using and part of this was watching what other quilters were doing, other competitive quilters were doing. So that low loft cotton provides the structure. And when you're competing, one of the things that you need to be attentive to is that when you ship a quilt, cotton batting will hold on to the folds where things like silk and wool and polyester, when the quilt is hung, the folds will ease out.
Okay,
Where,
also didn't know that.
yeah, it is one of those things. So sometimes like if you see like more at the national shows, you'll at local shows you'll see this because they probably have had the quilt folded for a few days. But when quilts are shipped, we try to avoid it as best we can. But if you see a quilt that is like has some folds to it that are noticeable, it's because it's all cotton batting.
So how, uh, um, say that you've used cotton batting on a show quilt. Do you steam it out? Do you like,
Yeah,
what's,
you can steam it out. You can definitely steam it out. I have a trick, and I think we had this discussion in the ironing, when we talked about irons. I don't use anything in my irons. I will actually take water or the magic spray that I have, and I will spritz my quilts until they're just damp, and then I will use my iron to press them and get any folds or creases out of them. But when they're at a big show, you have to rely on gravity to actually take that out. So this is
Yeah.
where those alternative battings come into play. So one of the things that I recognized is that um, the type of fiber, if it's a plant fiber, so uh, bamboo or cotton or something along that line where it's plant-based, those tend to retain retain the folds. And if it's an animal fiber, so silk or wool, those tend to relax. So they don't hold those creases so much. And then polyester is a little bit of a different beast. We know polyester, you know polyester from the garment world. Polyester doesn't hold, I mean, you can crease it, but it doesn't hold a crease long term, right? Unless you stitch that in. Because I remember like pants in the 70s had that crease stitched in, so it would just stay that way and add a little bit of structure. So polyester will ease out over time, so you won't notice the whatever wrinkles. So polyester sort of kind of lives a little bit in both worlds.
I was worried, I think I was worried though that like my fabric wouldn't shrink and or my fabric would shrink and the polyester wouldn't. I think that was some of like my concern with using poly, but you're saying that it's gonna probably hold it more in its
at,
original.
at least in my experience, yes. But my other question, I think when we talked about washing fabrics, were you a washer or non-washer?